policy statement for Indigenous biodiversity and the update on our draft, on the exposure draft release. So I think we have Simon and we don't have Dave, sorry. No. What was your name? Alistair. Thank you, sorry about that. Just want to introduce yourselves, the process going forward for councillors, and then we'll move to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Hills. This morning, here to talk to you about the proposed National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity, the recent release of an exposure draft for consultation. My name is Simon Fraser. I'm a Senior Analyst in the Natural Environment Strategy team. Alongside me, I have Alistair Jamieson, Principal Advisor for Natural Environment Specialist Services and INES, and online also have Jenny Fuller, Team Leader, Regional Planning and Plans and Places. So this afternoon we'll just run through an overview of what's in the proposed NPSIB and the core concepts, how the Auckland Council Group is responding to their exposure draft, and then finish on the decision sought today and next steps. The NPS for Indigenous Biodiversity aims to protect, maintain and restore Indigenous biodiversity, recognising the threats to our unique flora and fauna and halt the ongoing decline of our Indigenous species and habitats, while recognising the importance of that our native habitats provide. It does this in a way that recognises the role of tangata whenua as kaitiaki and also people as stewards of Indigenous biodiversity, and also to provide for the social, economic and cultural wellbeing that Indigenous biodiversity provides. The NPSIB helps provide further regulatory support for the protection of significant Indigenous flora and fauna, which is listed as a matter of national importance under Section 6 of the RMA, and also helps enable 8 of the 11 other matters of importance under Section 7, such as kaitiakitanga and stewardship. The focus of the NPS for Indigenous biodiversity is mainly on terrestrial biodiversity, but there is some exceptions. And this version of the NPSIB has been in development since 2017, was started with the Biodiversity Collaborative Group, which was a working group with representatives from the environmental sector and NGOs, industry and representative from the Iwi Chairs Forum. The work of this group was further progressed by MFE and DOC and was released for a full public consultation in early 2020, which Auckland Council submitted on. This consultation now is an exposure draft of those updates since that previous public consultation. The focus is on the workability of the updated NPS rather than the policy intent. And consultation on this closes on 21 July, so there's a 6-week consultation period there. The NPSIB has 3 core concepts. The first is the vision statement Te Reo o Te Harakeke, which has 6 principles, recognising the value and Māori of biodiversity, the bond between people and Indigenous biodiversity, the responsibility of tangata whenua as kaitiaki, and also New Zealanders as stewards, the connectivity between biodiversity and the wider environment, the incorporation of Te Ao Māori and Mataranga Māori, and also a requirement for engaging with tangata whenua. Second concept is around the maintenance of Indigenous biodiversity. So the core part of this is at least no reduction, and that's in relation to the size, range, extent, properties and functions, connectivity and resilience of Indigenous species, ecosystems and habitats. And then the third core concept is implementing an effects management hierarchy for the management of Indigenous biodiversity. There's 2 core pillars to the NPSIB, so there's a regulatory side and then there's also a strategic component to it. For the regulatory component on screen, we have a list of the main requirements there. So we have implementing the vision, making sure that regional and district plans provide for Te Reo o Te Harakeke. Core component there around identifying, mapping and protecting significant natural areas. Now Auckland Council has done an SNA-like exercise with our significant ecological areas under the AUP. Working with mana whenua around identifying and protecting taonga species and ecosystems. There's also requirements to maintain Indigenous biodiversity outside of SNAs, managing the effects of land use activities, and then also promoting restoration. And there's some additional specific requirements, for example, relating to management of Indigenous biodiversity on Māori land, increasing Indigenous vegetation cover, and information and monitoring requirements. The other part of MPSIB is regional councils are required to produce a regional biodiversity strategy. The purpose of this is to set out a landscape scale vision for how a region is going to restore and protect its Indigenous biodiversity, and sets out how this is going to be achieved, which includes actions that councils are going to undertake, but also how councils are going to work with landowners, iwi and other stakeholders in managing and restoring Indigenous biodiversity. In the report provided in para 27, just detailing the key timeframes for implementing the MPSIB, MFE have indicated they are aiming for gazettal later this year. Within 3 years, councils are required to have a regional biodiversity strategy underway. 5 years for all councils to have SNAs identified, mapped and notified, and then 8 years for the implementation of provisions of the MPSIB. So 2030 is that timeframe. Auckland Council's response. So the Natural Environment Strategy team have been coordinating a response. So I'm holding the pen on that submission at the moment, and with support from my team. We've been seeking input from across the council group, including CCOs, and are currently working through the feedback we've received. And just want to thank the staff from across those various teams, both within council and the CCOs, for their input so far. The submission focusing on the type of feedback being sought, so noting the consultation is focusing on the workability of the MPS, but we are also highlighting areas where we felt there's been opportunities missed around the policy intent and how we think MPSIB could be strengthened to improve the direction to promoting the restoration of biodiversity. Also being ensuring alignment with our previous submission in March 2020, making sure we're not going against previous direction, and also ensuring our feedback aligns with current council direction, so strategic plans such as the climate plan, the AUP, and then operational biodiversity programs as well. We've also been contributing to the regional sector submission as well, working alongside our colleagues from other regional and unitary authorities under the regional sectors Te Uru, Kahika banner as well. Just running through some of the key points of the submission that we're drafting at the moment, and points I wanted to highlight to councillors today. Firstly, we see there's an issue around the alignment of biodiversity provisions across environmental domains, very much missing an opportunity for a more integrated approach and taking a Kia to Kitai or mountains to the sea view when managing biodiversity. While the MPSIB does say we do have to give regard to this, we feel like the provisions don't necessarily support a fully integrated management view across these domains. There's also some inconsistencies with how biodiversity is managed across other regulatory tools and MPSs. For example, the MPSIB focuses on managing threatened and at-risk species in the terrestrial space, while in the freshwater space, MPSFM only covers threatened species. There's also little direction on how the MPSIB works within the other regulatory tools. The New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement is the only one where there's a specific section around the relationship. And there's also some misalignment of definitions, which creates some ambiguity and confusion. Alongside this, some opportunities to strengthen the protection and management of Indigenous biodiversity and keep in line with it as a matter of national importance. So while MPSIB includes a strong at least no reduction directive, We feel like this could be further strengthened with a hierarchy of obligations, such as that seen within MPSFM and the Te Manawa Te Wai concept. MPSIB is also missing the ability for councils to adopt more stringent measures if they wish, which features in many other MPSs. And the ability for councils to recognise and protect regionally threatened species is rather limited within MPSIB, relying on the national level threat classifications. We're flagging our submission the need for support and resourcing for Māori and iwi. Councils are required to recognise tangata whenua and their role as kaitiaki and work alongside iwi in decision making and management on Indigenous biodiversity to the extent which they wish to be involved. And this includes the identification and management of taonga species, which potentially could be a significant task to undertake. We're already aware of how stretched the iwi of Tamaki Makaurau are in working with council, particularly with the range of national direction that's been implemented at the moment, and really urging the central government to ensure support and resourcing is available so iwi are able to work alongside us and effectively implement the requirements of the MPSIB and the vision in particular. We're also flagging some workforce capability gaps, particularly for ecological expertise, and that's both within councils, but also for the private sector and those consent applicants and landowners, ensuring they have the best advice available to help manage the effects of biodiversity. We're also seeking some additional guidance from central government, particularly around the process for demonstrating how councils such as us who have already undertaken an SNA exercise, the process for demonstrating compliance for that with the new MPS, and also how to value Indigenous biodiversity to support decision making. It's a very, as noted in the paper, it's a very conscientious topic. And would particularly help with managing the tension of protecting environmental outcomes versus the need for growth and development, and adding some extra rigour to councils making that judgment call. Also flagging another number of technical amendments, so just highlighting a couple of those. Seabirds are absent from the provisions for specified highly mobile fauna, and noting that Auckland region is a biodiversity hotspot for a number of Indigenous seabirds. Seeking some further clarity on SNA provisions, particularly around how significant national and regional public benefit is determined and how that applies to the effects management hierarchy, ensuring the effects on Indigenous biodiversity are managed. So just to wrap up, just seeking today a decision to delegate authority to the chair and deputy chairs of both ENCC and the planning committee, recognising MPSIB as a planning tool, and also to a member of the IMSB. And the next steps, so currently drafting the submission, intending to have that available for delegated members approximately a week before submissions close on 21 of July. And we'll also provide a future update to the relevant committee post-election around our implementation program for how council is going to implement MPSIB, so that will likely be early next year. So that's an overview of the presentation, and open that up for questions.
Perfect, thank you. Thank you very much. For that, we've got 4 questions so far. Simon, Councillor Cooper is first.
Sorry, thank you. It was just around our current work with protecting Kāori, you know, with the whole Kāori dieback for Phytophthora. Does this, I mean, what we're doing already to protect that biodiversity, is that covered in this? Is that the kind of work or more work we'd need to do to protect some of our threatened flora and fauna?
Oh, Alice, if you just want to, should work. Oh, we'll just bring a mic. Oh, thanks, Simon. Sorry about that. We're just switching mics, team.
Okay.
Kia ora, through you, Mr. Chair. So the Kauri dieback work is largely driven by our responsibilities under the Biosecurity Act and through Council's commitments that it's made through the Regional Pest Management Plan. This work interrelates with it and will lead to more action, I think, for managing other effects on Kauri ecosystems. So while this doesn't focus on the biosecurity threat of Kauri dieback, it will lead to greater consideration for other aspects of managing those ecosystems and indeed all of Auckland's ecosystems. I think it's fair to say that the intent of the NPSIB is consistent with quite a lot of the current action that Auckland Council is taking for ecosystems and species, but it will lend more weight to that, and I think it's likely to, without getting ahead of what might be in a regional biodiversity strategy under this NPS, it's likely to lead to more focus and attention to ecosystem protection.
Thank you. And just another one, Mr. Chair, in terms of things like, for example, at the moment, we're still deliberating on the Regional Park Management Plan. I guess in future, then would have to then express in those sorts of plans this NPS?
Through you again, Mr. Chair. As Simon has outlined, this NPS has been in preparation for a very long time, so it has been considered in the preparation of the Regional Parks Management Plan, and there are some policies in the Regional Parks Management Plan around ecosystem and species protection that are consistent with this NPS. It may bring...
Okay, as long as we're ahead of the game.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Walker.
So just a real quick question. We've got the NPS UD, and then we've got the MDRS, you know, the three houses everywhere, and the relationship between that and qualifying matters as it goes to special ecological areas. So my question is, does this process that we're giving feedback on enhance the protection of the SEAs, particularly where there's a relationship with these two pieces of legislation? And if so, are we covering that off in our submission immediately? Thanks.
Through you, the Chair. Thank you for the question, Councillor Walker. There's definitely some tension there between NPSIB and NPSUD. The SEA is a qualifying matter for NPSUD. I might ask Jenny if you would like to elaborate a bit more on that question.
Thanks, Simon, and good afternoon, committee members. Yes, there is a tension there. There is an issue we have, well, as Simon outlined, the SEAs, RSEAs, which essentially equate to the SNAs that are discussed in the NPS Indigenous Biodiversity. They are a qualifying matter for the urban development responsibly developing, and there is an issue we have in relation to the identification of those SNAs, because many members will be aware of the restrictions in the RMA around protection of urban trees. And those restrictions relate to the use of district plan provisions to protect urban trees. And as a response, in Auckland Council, we've used regional plan provisions, which aren't so similarly limited. And what this NPS does not identify, at least explicitly, that we can keep using regional provisions. We're reasonably confident they're not implying that we can't, but we are seeking potentially some clarification on that. So in terms of whether this takes us any further. I think that the NPS Indigenous Biodiversity does bring in some more protection in some ways than we have in our plan. So potentially when we implement the NPS Indigenous Biodiversity, we might need to look at our SNA provisions and see if we're stacking up, including in the urban environment. But overall, I think this NPS Indigenous Biodiversity supports the current approach we have of using the SNAs as a qualifying matter, but we might need to revisit our approach to the SNAs in light of this NPS when it's in effect, and just which in turn may have some implications for how we frame those qualifying matters in the future.
So just back to my question, are we going to be referencing in our feedback here the NPS UD and the MDRS as relevant pieces of legislation that impact on this, so it cuts both ways?
I think more to the point, we want to ensure that we can keep using the SNAs as a qualifying matter. I think the nothing in the NPS urban development tells us that we can't protect Indigenous biodiversity, and this NPS, the Indigenous biodiversity one, will give us greater ability to do that. I think there's undoubtedly a tension though, Councillor. We already have quite strong protective mechanisms for SEAs in urban environment, and they work reasonably well, but we know there are moments when they don't always work that well, and those pressures are going to be exacerbated, of course, by the implementation of the NDRS and NPS urban development. So I think it's an ongoing challenge for us, but we've got the foundations for an approach that will work and will help us protect our SNAs, but we will need to be revisiting those, and I think in particular in light of what happens with implementation as well. How does it go going forward in terms of what happens to our urban SNAs in the light of the intensification pressures that will come from this? So I don't know if that answers your question, sorry, Councillor, but I think there is a relationship there. We would be pointing that out in our submission to this NPS, that, if at the moment, if it only goes forward as a district plan provision, we will be severely undermined in our ability to protect urban biodiversity. And I think in the future, we may need to, we are already trying to protect our SNAs in the light of the NPS urban development, and I would advocate that as we go forward, we have some pretty intense monitoring on that and just seeing how that's playing out, whether there's any additions we need to make to our response.
I might just add to that and within our submission on the NPSIB, we will be seeking further clarity from MFE around how the process for dealing with those conflicts between those regulatory tools, because currently that's not clear at the moment.
Thank you for your question, Councillor Walker. And myself and Jenny have discussed this at length around how we ensure we're protecting our SEAs, but probably building on them. I guess my question, just because we're on this topic and thinking about the qualifying matters, essentially you all believe we have a strong case to protect our SEAs and have that low density zone underneath it. But do you believe when this comes in, this MPS could then supersede some of the MDRS, MPS UD, because it's broader than our SEAs are, as an SNA? Or
it's a difficult question. I guess I would say not really. I think it doesn't the approach that's set out in the NPS Indigenous Biodiversity is not too different from the approach we have in our plan. So we are all sort of consistent with the approach that they're advocating, but I think it's going to be a matter of fine tuning and monitoring to see what happens, because as I said, we already know, notwithstanding that we have a pretty good approach in our plan, like our plan already says, when you're locating a new house in the urban environment, you should be looking for a building platform outside the SNA, otherwise you need a consent. So we still have that, and we will still have that, but the devil's in the implementation. And we understand the pressures are such that, where there's ever any discretion in the decision making, we just need to watch very closely what happens to that and see if we do need to strengthen our provisions to make it clearer what we're talking about in terms of protection of urban SNAs.
And will we be able to use the MPS for Indigenous biodiversity as evidence for our SEAs through the MP SUD plan change? Will we be able to use, because essentially they're saying the same thing, so how could they push back on it?
Yeah, exactly. I think yes. I think I think part of our response is that with the MPS, Indigenous biodiversity is obviously very important to the government, and it's just as important as urban development. So I think it is about that tension, the integration of the two tools. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, Simon. Don't you have anything to add to that, Simon?
Just might note that The process within NPSIB for identifying SNAs is very similar to the process which we have undertaken for VCAs, so they are very similar.
Right. And we're ahead of the game because we did that work for the unitary plan.
Yes, we are. There's a number of councils around the country which haven't undertaken that exercise yet, so we are very much ahead of the game in that aspect.
Perfect, thank you. Member Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chief. Thank you, Jenny and Simon. And I know you have had some kōrero, some with the Secretariat, so that's appreciated. Just a couple of things. The tangata whenua in the documentation as opposed to mana whenua, whether that was driven by legislation or otherwise. And then in respect of the NPSIB, is there anything that's currently existent within Council's processes that relates to Indigenous biodiversity that is already not doing the trick? That's not a nice way of putting it. Is already in train that can talk to that, because there's a lot of kōrero. I'll leave the third question, which is around engagement. So can I just make a start with those two pātai, please?
Through the Chair. Thank you, Member Wilson. Yes, I believe the use of tangata whenua is driven more by legislation, noting that generally Auckland Council would refer to mana whenua and matawaka. With the second question, noting, as we just said, around the SEAs and SNAs, the provisions we have in place in Auckland are very similar. As far as other provisions within the Auckland Unitary Plan, there are some areas where the AUP is more stringent, but the NPS also does have a few areas where we will have to strengthen the AUP as well. So there's a couple of balances there which will have to be undertaken. Operationally, we have a pretty strong biodiversity management program through the biodiversity focus areas already underway, managing biodiversity on council land and also working with landowners, providing advice and also to community groups across the region in that aspect. So one of the advantages of being a unitary authority in this aspect is that we can blend those regional versus TA functions in the management of biodiversity and take a more integrated approach to how we manage biodiversity across the Auckland region.
So just off the top of your head, which I know will always be on the top of your head, for the gaps that may exist currently in terms of Auckland Council process that could potentially feature in the submission, apart from the engagement piece that you've outlined in the MIS, can you tell me if there is any thinking around what that could involve? And then my last pātai is, I might have missed it, aroha mai, was there an intention or has it already been expressed about the mana whenua feedback to date that was to be outlined in today's meeting?
Through you, the Chair. I guess, top of my mind for gaps is particularly the identification of taonga species, and that will require significant work with the iwi across Auckland for that. There are increased monitoring and information gathering requirements for council as well, which we will be having to work through. They're kind of the two key things off the top of my head. I guess there's a tension that we're working through around how do we enable development and infrastructure growth while balancing the need to maintain and protect our Indigenous biodiversity. So we're working through that, particularly with those managing assets across the Auckland region. For your second question, so from what was noted in the paper, no further feedback from mana whenua at this stage. So the feedback which we did receive from iwi was a thank you for notifying them to the opportunity to submit, and they indicated that they were going to submit directly to MFE.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilson. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, team, for your work here on the NPSIB, the exposure draft. Has this been tested by MFE, say with Water Care, with Auckland Transport, with you guys directly and or with private property owners about the practicalities and achievability of what's been proposed here?
Through you,
Or is that
Chair.
yet to happen?
I guess there's been some work that has been underway. There's also, just noting the tensions I mentioned previously, there's a range of views across council around do the provisions with the NPSIB go far enough to protect biodiversity against, are they permissive enough to allow us to provide the infrastructure services that we're required to provide? So that's something we are working through as a council at the moment, which may not be resolved, I believe, with MFE for the NPS itself, but it's more, I guess, an implementation matter for us to resolve as we're working through our responsibilities to implement the NPS.
All right, just thank you. Might get hold of Warren McLennan and invite you guys to the next Rural Advisory Panel to talk through the submission, which the next RAP is on the 5th of August, the final one for this term. So, yeah, thank you.
Yes, we'll touch base with Warren and get an item on the agenda for that.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Is it last question, Member Wilcox? Glenn, if you might be on mute if you're... Member Wilcox, have you dropped off? I'll just wait one more couple seconds. I just hope it's not our fault. Apologies, Member Wilcox. If you could send questions through, if you can still hear us, and we'll get those covered off. Apologies, we couldn't hear from you. Right, well, that's all we have. So thank you, Simon and Alistair. That was very thorough and helpful. We will just move to debating the item, so we'll ask you both to move from the table. Thank you, Jenny, online, and thank you to your everyone working on this. Right, I'll move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Young. I think it's pretty straightforward. I'd just like to quickly, thank the teams for working on this. This will be a submission based on our previous submissions, our strategies and plans, and acknowledge that this is actually a really good thing. The National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity is going to help us on all the work we're already doing as a council and our strategies and plans going forward to protect our, essentially our Indigenous biodiversity, but also we know that it will help us in our evidence around our SEAs and how we address the issues in the NPSUD, which can, for community, feel quite, I guess, polarising, those two things coming together. But I think we have a strong base to start with, as we've done so much work on this already, as our SEAs are essentially the SNAs that other councils are now trying to put in place. So thank you all. I don't think there is any other speaking, so we'll go to the vote. All those in favour? Aye. Anyone opposed?
Aye.
Aye.
Perfect, thank you all.